Ah, self-isolation. The mere mention of it brings to mind images of loneliness, silence, and yes, for many, a creeping sense of despair. But does it have to be this way? What if I told you that isolation, when embraced with purpose, can be your most powerful tool of transformation? Self-imposed solitude is not the villain we've been led to believe. Instead, it's the cocoon in which the caterpillar becomes the butterfly, the place where growth happens in the quiet, away from the distractions of the world. So here we are, a moment in time where the world outside seems distant, perhaps even cold. The winter months ahead present us with a choice. Will we retreat into the isolation that feels like a prison? Or will we transform that solitude into something rewarding, something meaningful? Today, we will explore how self-isolation can be not just a necessity but a gift, one that, when used wisely, can lead you to become the best version of yourself. But it's all about approach, isn't it? That's what we're talking about today. How to take this winter season, this so-called isolation, and make it a personal winter arc that isn't depressing, but enriching. Now, when you hear the words self-isolation, it probably conjures images of someone alone in a room, left with their thoughts, often leading to feelings of sadness, or even worse, depression. But here's the twist. Isolation doesn't need to be a pitfall. Done with intention, it can be the most enlightening, rewarding experience of your life. Let me tell you a story. A man I once knew, we'll call him David. David was a textbook dismissive avoidant, always keeping people at arm's length, charming on the outside. But when things got too intimate, too close, he would withdraw. You see, people like David are terrified of vulnerability. They shroud themselves in solitude not out of choice, but out of fear. They convince themselves that they are self-sufficient, that they don't need connection. But deep down, beneath all those layers of self-imposed isolation, there is a different kind of longing. Now, David's solitude was not rewarding. It was a defense mechanism. But what if, instead of seeing isolation as a shield from pain, you used it as a tool for growth? What if you flipped the narrative and turned this winter of isolation into a time of inner exploration, where instead of running away from the world, you embraced the silence and used it to discover who you truly are? The first step, of course, is intention. Many enter isolation out of necessity. Perhaps the world has forced them into a kind of solitude, or they are trying to escape the noise. But the key to turning this from a sad retreat into a rewarding arc is to choose it, to actively decide, I am going to take this time for me. Not because I need to hide, not because I'm afraid, but because I recognize the value in silence. Think of it this way. When the world outside grows cold and the days grow short, this is nature's way of inviting us to go inward. Just as the earth pauses to gather its strength before the burst of spring, so too must we allow ourselves a period of rest, reflection, and growth. But to make it rewarding, we must be purposeful. Let's begin by dismantling some misconceptions about isolation. Many believe that isolation must lead to depression, that being alone with oneself is inherently a lonely experience. But I tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. It is not the isolation that creates sadness. It is what we do with it that determines its outcome. Isolation, when embraced with intention, can be the most rewarding experience of your life. Imagine, if you will, that your mind is a grand library filled with books and knowledge, experiences and dreams, yet, until now, you've only skimmed the surface. You've allowed others to dictate which books you read, which aisles you explore. But in this moment of isolation, when the world quiets down, you have the rare opportunity to delve into those corners of your mind that you've left unexplored. This is your chance to ask the bigger questions. Who am I? What do I truly desire, and how will I get there? One of the greatest mistakes people make in isolation is letting the mind wander aimlessly. The endless distractions of social media, the news, even idle thoughts. They swirl around, filling the space where creativity, focus, and purpose should reside. The first step in making your isolation rewarding is to silence the noise. This isn't about avoiding others. It's about avoiding unnecessary distractions. Write down the things that consistently pull you away from your goals and commit to removing them, if only for a time. For you see, in the absence of distraction, clarity begins to emerge. I often think of isolation like a well-tended garden. In the quiet, away from the chaos, you plant seeds of thought, of purpose, and if you water them, if you tend to them daily, something remarkable will grow. But this takes discipline. Many enter isolation with no plan, no intention, and thus, they emerge no different than when they entered. If you are to transform this winter into your personal arc of growth, you must have a goal, a vision. Let's talk about rewards. Yes, even in solitude, rewards are important. But these are not external rewards. No, they are rewards you give yourself for small victories. Perhaps it's a day spent with a good book, a moment of reflection by the fire, or simply the act of allowing yourself to dream. Set goals for this isolation period, and then reward yourself for each milestone you achieve. And these milestones needn't be grand. Progress, after all, is not about leaps and bounds, but small, steady steps forward. Of course, many will ask, but what about the loneliness? Ah, yes, loneliness. A word we've been taught to fear. But loneliness, like pain, is not something to be avoided. It is something to be understood. When you feel lonely in isolation, what you are truly feeling is the absence of distraction. You are finally sitting with yourself. And that, my friends, can be unsettling. For many of us have spent our lives running from our own thoughts, our own fears. But in isolation, there is nowhere to run. And that is where the magic happens. To sit with yourself, to face those thoughts head on, without the comfort of noise, is one of the bravest acts of all. And I tell you, once you pass through that initial discomfort, what awaits on the other side is something profound. You see, self-isolation is not about turning away from the world, it's about turning towards yourself. And when you do that, when you truly sit with yourself, without judgment, without fear, you begin to understand things you never did before. You begin to see patterns in your life, in your thoughts that were previously hidden. You begin to ask the deeper questions, the ones that have no easy answers. But these are the questions that lead to growth, to transformation. So let me ask you this. What if, instead of fearing isolation, you embraced it as the most important period of your life? What if, instead of seeing it as a time of loneliness, you saw it as a time of discovery? What if, instead of running from your thoughts, you welcomed them as old friends, eager to teach you something new? Because here's the truth. Isolation, when done with intention, is not a punishment. It's a gift. It's an opportunity to become the best version of yourself, to learn, to grow, to shed the layers that no longer serve you. And yes, it can be difficult. Yes, there will be moments of doubt, of discomfort. But isn't that true of all great transformations? So as we enter this winter season, I invite you to view your isolation not as a burden, but as a blessing. This is your time to plant new seeds, to tend to your inner garden, and to emerge from the cold not as you were, but as something more, something brighter, stronger, wiser. Remember, my friends, the caterpillar does not become the butterfly by staying out in the world. It retreats, it transforms, and only then does it take flight. So I ask you, are you ready for your winter arc?